This is the story of the Sages of Chelm, and a sage is a wise person. It's where we get the word sagacity from, or sagacious. So we're looking at wise people. And wise people are a place called Chelm. And Chelm is in Poland, so this is an Eastern European story, and it's from the Yiddish tradition, so I tell it in honour of my own Jewish ancestors. So this is the story of the Sages of Chelm, and this is how I will tell it to you. I want to take you back to a time before street lighting was common, and certainly in the small city of Chelm in the east of Poland, street lighting was not known. So going around at night could be very tricky. It wasn't always the safest thing to do, not least because you could trip over things, bump into people, walk into buildings. The thing you had to rely on, of course, was moonlight. And the problem with moonlight is it's not reliable. It's only full for a very brief period of the month. And the people of Chelm were getting quite fed up with this. So they had a meeting in the synagogue. And at that meeting, they realised that the problem with the city of Chelm, the town of Chelm, was they didn't have their own moon. They were having to share it with other people. I mean, why else would it only be full for a very short period of the month? Obviously, other people were having it full at different times of the month from them, and they were having to share it with other people, and this wasn't fair. A town of their standing should have its own moon, not have to share with other people. So the people of Chelm decided that they would buy their own moon, and then it would be full the whole time. So the people of Chelm gathered all the treasure they could spare, all the silver they had at home that they weren't using at that particular moment, anything that was locked away, and they gathered it all together, and the rabbi counted it all and made sure they knew exactly how much there was, and they put it in a sack. And they chose the wisest people, the sages of Chelm, to go and buy a moon for the town. Now, they didn't need to be reminded why they needed a moon, for the night before had been as dark as anyone could remember. The night was like black velvet. Certainly you could see the stars in the sky, but they do not give very much light. So, that morning, when the sages of Chelm set off with their stoutest cart and their strongest horse, they knew what their task was. And they travelled. They travelled by day, and they stayed in an inn by night. When I say stayed in the inn, obviously they didn't want to spend money that would mean they wouldn't have enough to buy the moon, so they actually stayed in the stables of any inn that they came to. And so they would take the cart round the back of the inn and go into the stables and lie in the straw and look out through the stable doors at the night sky. And on their first night away from their hometown of Chelm, they noticed that the inn was in a town where they did have a little bit of moon, just a sliver of moon, hardly anything. And the sages of Chelm talked to each other about how they would have a full moon, not like these poor people who had just a little sliver of moon. The next night they stayed in another inn, and they slept in the stables rather than the inn itself, and they looked out through the open doors of the stables and looked up in the sky, and they saw the stars, and they saw that this town where this inn was had a little bit more moon. And this went on, day after day, night after night, for 2 weeks, and they noticed the further away they got from Chelm, the richer people must have been, because their moons were bigger than the ones that they had passed the night before. Until, after 2 weeks, they came to an inn, and they settled in the stables, and they looked up in the sky, and they saw a full moon. And they knew what they had come for they saw that full moon up in the sky, and they knew that's what they wanted for their own town. And they sighed. As they sighed, the innkeeper happened to be passing the stables, and he asked them why they were sighing looking at the moon, and they explained to him that they had travelled all the way from Chelm to buy their own moon because they had to put up with sharing a moon with other people because it was only full for a little period of the month. So the innkeeper looked at them and said, "You wish to buy a moon?" And the Sages of Chelm said, "Oh yes, do you know where we can buy one? Because you seem to have this beautiful moon in the sky, and that's exactly what we want." And the innkeeper looked at them and said, "As it happens, I think I've got a spare moon in the barn at the back. Look, I'm going to find some more cheese for my customers. You wait here, come and find me in half an hour round the back in the barn, and I'll see if I can dug out that moon for you." And so off he went, round the back of the stables towards the barn, leaving the Sages of Chelm to wait half an hour. But of course none of them had watches, so they just had to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, I don't know whether they actually managed to count the full half hour or whether they sped up with it. Eventually they gave up and they went round the back. And in the light of the full moon they saw the landlord of the inn standing, leaning on a barrel. And he smiled at them and said, "Come on, come over here. You're in luck. I found the spare moon and I don't need it, so I'm prepared to sell it to you." And the Sages of Chelm gathered round, and the innkeeper said, "I keep it here, in this barrel. You have to keep it safe, you understand. Keep it fresh, so I keep it in water." So he lifted off the lid of the barrel, and the Sages of Chelm stood in the light of a full moon which was directly over them, and leant over and looked into the water of the barrel. And what did they see in the water of the barrel? They saw the full moon. And the Sages of Chelm gasped. And the innkeeper said, "Oh, is this what you're looking for? I can tell by your gasp this is exactly what you're looking for, but I'm going to put the lid back on, because if I leave the lid off, it's quite likely that the moon will just fly out of the water up in the sky, and then we'll have 2 full moons, and we really don't need them in this town. We already have one up there in the sky, which is why this one is spare. Now tell me, how much can you pay me for this moon?" And the Sages of Chelm talked to each other about whether this was a good deal, and obviously it was. Here was a full moon, it was kept fresh in water, they would be able to take it home in the barrel. Everything was ready for them. So they presented the innkeeper with their sack of silver and precious metal, and the innkeeper looked inside the sack, and he felt the weight, and he smiled to himself, and he smiled to the Sages of Chelm, and said, "But let me nail down the barrel, because we don't want that moon escaping before you get home, do we?" So he nailed down the lid of the barrel, and the next day they moved the barrel onto the cart. And the innkeeper said, "Now you remember, do not open this barrel until you get home. Because if you do, there's a danger the moon will escape and fly up in the sky, and then you won't have your full moon that you have paid for. And that will not be my fault." So the Sages of Chelm set off back home. And of course, it took them 2 weeks. And over those 2 weeks, they travelled by day and stayed in the stables of inns by night. And not because they wanted to save money this time, but because they had no money left. Well, very little anyway, just enough to pay for stables. But they would lie in the stables and look out in the sky, and every night they'd notice that the moon was getting thinner and thinner the closer they got home. So they knew they were getting closer to home, because they knew the closer to home they got, the poorer the people got, because they had so little moon up in the sky. They arrived home, having travelled all day. They arrived home when the sky was once more like black velvet, and only stars were to be seen. And the people of Chelm gathered round the cart with their torches to welcome the Sages of Chelm back home. And the Sages of Chelm and the people of Chelm manoeuvred the barrel onto the ground. And then they removed all the nails except the last one, and they left the honour of removing the last nail of the lid of the barrel to the rabbi. And the rabbi removed the last nail, and the Sages of Chelm lifted off the lid, and the people of Chelm gathered round and looked inside the barrel, and there was nothing. And the Sages of Chelm knew what had happened. They knew that one of their number must have been so desperate to see the moon that they got up in the middle of the night while the others were asleep in one of the stables they stayed in, had prized open the barrel, the moon had escaped, and then they'd nailed the lid back. And so there was a huge row, an enormous confusion, great trouble in the town. And great trouble in the town that went on for some time. But you know, I wonder if they waited a couple of weeks and opened the barrel again. If they opened it standing under a full moon in the sky, they might have found that their own moon perhaps had just sunk to the bottom of the barrel, because if they looked then, they'd see, there it is, floating on the surface once more. But now, of course, Chelm has street lighting, which is a very good thing, because without it, I think the sages of today's Chelm would have just as many problems as those in my story of the Sages of Chelm, and that was how I have told it to you.